Joining us now, Sheema Khan, the country's most prominent patent agent.
Thank you.
But Sheema, nobody knows that that's what you are. They know you from your monthly columns in the Globe and Mail, and they know you as the author of Hockey and Hijab, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman. And we're happy that you could spare some time for us at TVO.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Let's start with an excerpt from the book. "You've been brainwashed," asserted my good friend. We were in the final stages of a graduate school at Harvard, she in fine arts, I in chemical physics. Nazila was staunchly secular, having fled the Iranian Revolution with her family for the safe haven of America. I had been nominally Muslim until late 1988, when I went through a spiritual reawakening after much soul-searching. The changes inside me were partly reflected in the changes outside, consisting of a greater modesty in appearance and behavior. My hijab threw most people for a loop. Okay, that gets us started on unpacking the title of your book here, The Hijab. Your friends and family, many of them anyway, were not prepared for this. Why do you think they had so much trouble accepting you with that thing?
Well, if you'd seen me before hijab, I was sort of known as a party-hardy kind of person, and I was never overtly Muslim. I didn't, for example, pray regularly or observe the fast, so I was culturally Muslim, and it seems like everything changed overnight in the eyes of many people. But for me, I had been going through a lot of questioning about myself, about my honesty with regards to my faith, and I just decided that I wasn't going to be playing two ways anymore. I just wanted to be one.
How violent was the reaction?
Well, a family was quite shocked. A lot of my friends, my friend Nazla, I've changed her name, we're still good friends, but the very secular atheist friends were quite upset, very upset.
Well, there is that line where the reaction to your hijab leads you to believe that some people who profess to be liberals are only liberals insofar as, you know, your worldview equates to their worldview, and then that's the definition of liberal. Is that still prevalent in a lot of society?
I think it depends. That's the feeling I had when I was at Harvard. You know, everybody's liberal and modern, and then when you take a certain path, then you find out who's really liberal, in the sense that even if there's a worldview which is completely opposite to their own, they're not going to cut you off. And I think we don't have the luxury of cutting people off now with everything going on in the world. I think we have to become more open to differences. Closing ourselves off and cutting people off, I don't think that serves anyone's interest.
Okay, that's the hijab in the subtitle. Now how about the hockey in the title? Did you really introduce women's hockey to Harvard?
No, no, no. I introduced women's intramural house league hockey at Harvard. They didn't have house league. I was at McGill doing my undergraduate, and I played house league with a physics engineering and an engineering team. And when I came to Harvard, they didn't have any of that for the women. They had house league for the men. And the great thing about Harvard is if you have an idea, they say go for it. So that's what we did. And I found a couple of other friends, and soon word spread, and we were having a blast.
Now, when you did this hockey business, were you wearing the hijab at that point?
No, at that point I wasn't. At that point I was not wearing hijab.
And
so.
when did there ever come a point where you played hockey with the hijab?
Oh yeah,
on?
yeah. You know, afterwards when I wore the hijab, and you know, then I resumed my after I got married and had kids. But after that, I did play hockey. I don't play anymore because my knees won't let me skate. I play in the driveway with my kids. I do play soccer, though, regularly. So
did you get the double take, though? Because you don't look like you came off the farms of Kelvington, Saskatchewan. You don't mind my saying, right? You don't look like a typical hocky player.
Well, you know, hockey equipment lends itself. So you can't tell I'm wearing a hijab because I've got a helmet.
Oh,
so,
okay.
you know, you really can't tell. But it's fun to surprise people.
Now, the rest of the title, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman. And I was interested in the order in which you put those words. A Canadian Muslim rather than a Muslim Canadian. Is there a difference there?
In my mind, no. I just, you know, when I think of how I describe myself, those are the first two adjectives that came to my mind in that particular order. It was just a very natural.
I'm going to interrupt you because one is an adjective, one is a noun. And it depends which one modifies which. Are you a Muslim who happens to be Canadian, or are you a Canadian who happens to be Muslim?
I'd say the latter. I'm a Canadian who happens to be Muslim.
But you didn't say that in the title of the book.
Well, this is what came to my mind at first, and how I see
for some people,
myself.
the modifiers is what's all important.
Yes,
What's your foundation?
Well, my foundation is, culturally speaking, I'm Canadian. I spent 95% of my life here, and spiritually I'm Muslim. And both those identities have melded into who I am. So, you know, that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, so people shouldn't read too much into
No.
the order here.
No, no. Not in this edition, at least.
Not
I'll have
in
to go
this
back.
edition. All
I'll have to
right.
go back and give us more careful thought. So.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about Islamophobia. Ontario Human Rights Commission says that since the arrest of the Toronto 18, there's been a big rise in Islamophobia in this province, in this country. Do you see that?
Well, I see that in terms of the statistics, the various studies that come out. It's not a surprising sign when you do have such dramatic news coming out. And I think as Muslims, as a community is concerned, we have to do more to do outreach to show Ontarians and the rest of Canada that we are part of the society, that these 18 individuals are just that. They're 18 individuals. They're not reflective of who we are. And it's not just by words, but I think by actions that we'll have to do that.
But part of, presumably, Islamophobia is thinking racist thoughts about Muslims for no apparent good reason. And how do you actually know if that's on the rise? It's hard to measure thoughts, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing as the thought police. But, you know, if, for example, if there are incidences of hate crimes or the like, you know, we should be keeping an eye on that because that is one indicator of, you know, of sentiment out there. Another indicator I think would have to look at are maybe complaints filed with human rights commissions based on discrimination on the basis of faith. That would be another indicator. But I mean, this is the reality, and you know the saying, if life gives you lemon, make lemonade. And so we're going to have to really struggle with educating people and also demonstrating that we're part of the solution.
But I want to make sure I understand, because you know, this institution gets criticized all the time for waving red flags where some people don't think they exist. And it's one thing to report that I am a Muslim, I didn't get to rent this apartment because the landlord said to me, you know what, you're a Muslim and I don't want any of your kind in here. I mean, that's obvious.
Right.
Less obvious is, you know, what somebody might be thinking if they're eyeballing you on the subway. How, you know, do you see the distinction between the two?
I see the distinction, and while it would be, you know, the ideal world if people didn't have those thoughts, you know, I think what you'd hope is that prejudices aside, that won't stop people from participating in society. And that's why all these human rights laws really are based on actions, not what people think.
Let me ask you about broader Muslim society, which still has a lot to cope with internally, as you well know. There is still a segment of Muslim society that thinks, for example, it's okay to beat your wife up.
Yep.
How much progress is being made on those kinds of issues?
Well, I think now it's now more out in the open, whereas before it used to be hush-hush. And this is the same experience that wider Canadian society has gone through as well. I mean, I don't remember how long ago, but maybe 25 years ago, an MP first brought up the issue of wife beating in the House of Commons in Ottawa, and she was laughed at.
Yes.
So this was just about 25, I mean, you know, not too long ago.
This is nothing unique to the Muslim community.
No, no, and the first step is awareness, to start talking about it, addressing it, and then building resources to deal with it. So progress is being made, but at a very, you know, slow level. But the fact that it started is very promising.
I think you're right that it was a woman who brought it up, and it was mostly the men, of course, who were laughing about it. I guess it was, Judy, say again, was it Margaret Mitchell, the NDP, who brought it up? Yeah, yeah. How important is it to get men in the Muslim community to start talking about these issues?
Very important, and I have...
Is that happening?
Well, I've seen it happen with several imams in my own experience. I remember when I was in Montreal in the late 90s, I volunteered at a women's shelter, and I came across several Muslim women with their children who were being beaten by their husbands or ex-husbands who said they were doing it in the name of Islam. And I went to my imam at my local mosque, who was a Nigerian, a very wonderful man, and he was great. He used one of the holiest days, one of the Eid prayers, where he had the largest audience, and he dealt with the issue head on. Same thing in Ottawa. There's an imam there who also spoken about it many times in the Friday sermon. We have the largest crowd condemning it.
Okay, but this just in. We don't always listen to our clergymen when they're up there giving sermons, right?
No, but they carry moral authority in a sense. And, you know, I think if you don't say anything, the silence often is being, is taken as condoning behavior. Whereas to say something to oppose it starts to send the message that, no, it's not something that we're just going to nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and sort of pretend doesn't exist.
So that's progress, you're saying?
It's progress. It's slow, but I think it's a good start.
Okay. Here's another excerpt from the book as we talk about something you've referred to as two-tiered citizenship. The contrast between the government's treatment of Mr. Khadr and Mr. Abdul Razik, two well-known names if you've been watching the news, with that of Brenda Martin, leave many wondering about the existence of two-tiered citizenship. Or, as Mr. Abdul Razik explained his detention, quote, "The Canadian government has a racist mind. It is because I am black and Muslim." Two-tiered citizenship. What do you mean by that?
It seems that there's a different standard depending on whether you're a certain type of Canadian in terms of your background, your look, your ethnicity, your heritage. I mentioned that example in the book. There's another example of a cleric that his name was Abdul Haq. Some group asked him to come and speak. He lives in the UK. The government said, no, you can't come because of things you said in the past. But that same government allowed Reverend Franklin Graham to come, who said equally bad things about other groups, compared to, again, to the previous Liberal government that had allowed a Jewish member of a banned terrorist group to come in and speak, and who said terrible things about Palestinians. So it just seems as a double standard. And all we're asking is, let's have the same standard for every Canadian or every person, regardless of their background.
Well, let's be more blunt about this. Brenda Martin, nice white lady from kind of rural Ontario, or where was she from? Waterloo, I think, or something?
Yeah. And she was convicted in Mexico, whereas the other two have, we all know their circumstances.
Yeah.
So
it's a double standard.
Definitely.
Many prominent Canadians, and you think of Joe Clark, Lloyd Axworthy, Flora MacDonald, Bill Graham, these are all high-ranking former politicians. They have raised the specter of discrimination in these cases. Do Muslim Canadians acknowledge that there is support from, some of the elites of this country for their cries? Yeah,
I think it's acknowledged, and also the fact just widespread support amongst ordinary Canadians. The whole Abdul Razik issue, I mean, ordinary Canadians risked, fine and possible sentencing for daring to provide money for his airplane ticket to come home. People responded to the call of Monia Mazik to help get her husband back and to call for an inquiry. This is a post-911 environment. So the wellspring, I think, of commitment to justice amongst ordinary Canadians is something that the Muslim community should not take for granted. I mean, it's something that we should appreciate.
Let's hit some Middle East politics right on the head here.
Sure.
I think it's fair to say this current federal government, well, listen, I'm not saying it, I've heard people in the Jewish community say it, is the most pro-Israeli government anywhere in the Western world. And they make no bones about it. In fact, they're happy they're happy to be known that way. How do you think that affects relations with Muslim Canadians?
Oh, I think it puts a huge damper because for many Muslim Canadians, not all, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a conflict which affects many people, not just Arabs. Most of the Palestinians are Muslim, not all, and it's and also the place of Jerusalem in the Muslim faith is quite it's quite high in terms of a spiritual nexus. That's one, but the fact that it seems not just that the present government is very pro-Israel, it seems to be not very friendly towards the Muslim or Arab community.
Where do you see that?
Well, I mean, I've followed bits and pieces, but they've had, Minister Kenny has had war of words and whatnot with some Arab groups. I don't think the fault is entirely his. There's been bad blood between both. But you just get the feeling that, because of the pro-Israeli stance of this government, they're not really willing to listen to the other side, namely the Palestinian side or the Arab side of the conflict.
I think their view would be, we've listened to the other side, but the fact is there's one democracy over there, and there's a lot of dictatorships surrounding that one democracy, and Canada's a democracy, and it's going to stand with its friend.
That's fine. Stand with the democracy, but hold that democracy accountable to democratic standards.
And the Arab countries as well?
Well, the Arab countries should also be held to, dictatorships should also be criticized. But let's not pretend that these dictatorships are existing in a vacuum. They are existing with help from the Americans and the Europeans. You know, no dictator there is standing there by himself without some kind of support.
Okay, but you talked about double standards a moment ago, and
Yeah.
do you think there's a double standard happening here? The Israeli government is being, perhaps being held up to a standard that its neighboring governments are not held up to?
Well, that argument has been said repeatedly, but if you're going to call yourself the only democracy in the Middle East, then you should be judged by that very label, I think.
Okay, well, here's a quote from the book. Let's go back almost a decade. Many have viewed the war on Iraq as a war against Islam. In the fall of 2002, a group of more than 200 prominent Muslims accused the United States of leading a crusade against Islam and warned that an assault on Iraq could provoke revenge attacks against Western targets. There is a feeling that we are powerless, said Tariq Ramadan, highly respected Swiss-based Islamic scholar who has written extensively on finding common ground between Muslims and the West. We can't speak about a clash of civilizations yet, but the ingredients are there, and after an attack on Iraq, they will be stronger. Do you think we're on the eve of a clash of civilizations?
I think we were precipitously close. Now that the Bush regime is no longer there.
Bush regime?
That's what I call it. He was there for 8 years, or the Bush administration.
I was going to say, he did get elected.
Yeah, Bush
Once
administration,
anyway.
right. is not, and you have a different tone from the Obama administration. I think this clash is, you know, the temperature has gone down a bit. But mind you, that could change depending, you know, on how military interventions turn out. In Afghanistan and Pakistan. Maybe there will be one in Yemen. We don't know. So it depends on the military policy of the United States.
I know you don't believe the Iraq war was justified, obviously. How about the war in Afghanistan?
The war in Afghanistan, I think, you know, after 9/11, because of covenants in place regarding NATO member organizations, you know, an attack on one is an attack on all. You know, there was precedent in terms of law to find the perpetrators and go after them. Of course, that's morphed into something much bigger. And as we're finding out right now, a military solution is not going to be the solution. At some point, there are going to have to be political talks, which who knows what they'll lead to.
Sometimes those can't happen until you beat down the other side a bit, though. So they say.
So they say, but I think people, you know, the Taliban was presumed almost dead, you know, in 2002, but they have come back stronger than ever. And so the military solution is not going to, it seems it's not going to work. It didn't work for the Soviets, it didn't work for the British, and I think now NATO member countries are finding out the same thing. That.
Would you say our involvement over there is analogous to the Soviet involvement?
No. No, not at all. I mean, the Soviet invasion, that was quite the brazen takeover of another sovereign nation that resulted in death and destruction, and really the predicament in which Afghanistan finds itself now. The Soviets were not there to rebuild society; they were there to take over it, and they, you know, eventually destroyed it. And now we're seeing the remnants of that, you know, of that destruction. And I think if there's a legacy that the West can leave, hopefully, is rebuilding. And I say that after reading 3 cups of tea and turning stones into schools. So.
Okay, let me take you from this country's #1 foreign policy issue to what a few years ago might have been probably one of this province's most important domestic policy issues. And that was the decision by Dalton McGuinty's government not to allow the option of some in the Muslim community who wanted to avail themselves of the option of using Sharia law to resolve disputes. What did you think of that decision?
At the time, I was a little surprised because you know, there had been this report by Marion Boyd, who had recommended.
She was the former Attorney General.
Exactly.
She was the head of a panel, and she recommended it. Sharia law be allowed to be used.
Right, and the fact that he didn't just ban the use of Sharia, but all religious arbitration.
Yes.
Meaning that the long-standing, you know, panels that the Jewish community used, or the Ismaili. I mean, everything was taken off the table. So at the time, I was a little surprised that step was taken. I was disappointed in the way that it was announced. It was announced on a Sunday, I remember, like at 4 p.m.
Oh, it wasn't announced. You
well,
kind of threw it off in a scrum.
Right, on September 11th, I forget the date, 2006, or But in retrospect, after looking at the issue even more, I think it was a wise decision. And in fact, the decision that they did come to is the best solution.
How come?
Well, because it allows for family arbitration. It allows people to refer to religious principles, but those religious principles cannot be made the basis of any arbitration decision. And I think it's good because the Sharia or the family arbitration based in Sharia that people want to use are really imports from overseas. And those imports, I don't think there's any way they satisfy the Charter in terms of gender equality. I don't think it would work.
Well, I was going to say, if there's a conflict between Canadian law and Sharia law,
Canadian law
is paramount.
Oh, for sure. But the thing is, how would you know? I mean, one of the things we said, well, decisions should be made public, of course, keeping the anonymity of those involved. Arbitrators, they should be trained. Just have a transparent, accountable system, not the hush-hush system that was in place at the time.
When that debate was going on, did you get calls or emails from people saying, you got to support us on this? I mean, they might have thought that you might have been open to Sharia law, but they might have, at least, that was my experience, getting calls from people saying, you got to get out there and publicize the fact that this can't be allowed to stand.
Right, well, when this group first proposed it, I forget the name of the group that first proposed using Sharia law, before they went public, they wanted support of some women in the community, and they contacted me, and I refused to sign on because I just...
You weren't very on side from the beginning.
No, I wasn't. But I was weighing the principles in place. Mm-hmm. The overall picture, and that's what I was weighing. But I wasn't crazy about, And when I asked people how, those who advocated, like, how would it work? How would you do this? How would you guarantee charter rights? No, they didn't have any answer. Nothing was in place. So I knew that this was a bad idea.
Okay, let's do one more thing here. Khalid Abu El Fadl and Abbas Milani, two very highly respected scholars who've been on this program arguing that devout Islamic rule and democracy, totally incompatible. One draws its legitimacy from the Quran, mm-hmm. Another draws its legitimacy from the people.
Yes.
Explain how you see Islam and democracy, as we understand it, working together.
Well, for example, in Canada, we have a constitutional democracy. Our democracy, people can't just, go willy-nilly and say we want this. It has to be within the parameters of our constitution, of our charter. If you want an analogy in Islam, the constitution would be based on the Quran, mm-hmm. and other sort of laws based on that foundation. So can the two coexist? I think they'll have to as we go forward. How can they? They're fundamentally in contradiction to each other, aren't they? In some places, yes, but in some places, no. And does that mean that we have to be on a collision course? I don't think so. I mean, there are other systems in the world which don't follow the democratic or the same kind of model that we have here. But
well, I'm not a Quranic scholar, obviously, but we have something. The Charter of Rights says the equality of men and women is about as important and basic as it gets.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure you don't see that in the Quran.
Well, in the Quran,
you'll argue with me, I know.
Well, no, I mean, there are guidelines in there.
Yeah, but you can't tell me that men and women are equal in Muslim
Before
society.
God? Oh, in Muslim society, many of them, no. In many of the society, I'm not defending Muslim cultures. By all means, I'm not. But in terms of equality, access to education, sort of the equality rights that we have here, I don't see any contradiction between those and what little I know. I mean, I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I defer to
you and me both.
Right. But if it was so contrary to my beliefs, I don't think I would be thriving here. I wouldn't be where I am right now, and I find no contradiction between, for example, the charter value and living as a Muslim, in terms of opportunities, in terms of what I believe in terms of participating in society.
I've seen the hijab, I haven't seen the hockey stick yet. Maybe you'll bring that next time. Of Hockey and Hijab, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman. I still think it should be called Reflections of a Muslim Canadian Woman, but we'll quibble about that another time. Sheema Khan, thanks a lot for visiting us today.
Thank you so much, Steve.